Good evening. I'm Susan Call. I'm the events advisor here at Politics and Prose, and on behalf of our owners and our entire staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Before we get started, a few familiar housekeeping items. This would be a good time to silence your cell phones. Also, during the Q&A, we have one mic tonight, and it's over there. If you can line up with your questions, that would be great, because we are recording this event. We have books behind the register. There will be a signing afterwards right here. And if you don't mind helping us out by folding your chairs, we'd be grateful. And be sure to take a look at our website. We've got a great rest of the month of events and classes and trips, and we're already booking into next year. So you're going to want to see what's ahead. And now I'm very excited to be introducing tonight's event with Alice McDermott for her exquisite new novel, Absolution. I'm a longtime fan of Alice's work, and I know this packed room, everyone here is as well. And I sat down to begin this book yesterday, and everything I was supposed to do went by the wayside. I could not stop reading. It's a truly gorgeous novel set in 1960 Saigon, centering on the lives of wives posted there largely as helpmeets for their CIA husbands, and it's full of lush detail and moral complexity. I was almost disappointed to have to dig a little into reviews to write this intro because I didn't want to spoil the story. I'm not quite finished, and I'll be mindful not to spoil anything here, but I'll just say that Kirkus has called this a masterpiece, an exquisitely conceived and executed novel that explores her signature topic, moral obligation, against the backdrop of the fraught time preceding the Vietnam War, and the Washington Post review calls Absolution beautifully conceived and executed. McDermott has written several novels, including the 1998 National Book winner Charming Billy. 3 of her novels have been Pulitzer finalists, and her work has appeared widely, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. For more than 2 decades, she taught at Johns Hopkins, and she's a member of the faculty at Swanee Writers Conference. And she's going to be in conversation tonight with Jacki Lyden, an award-winning NPR correspondent for over 3 decades. Jacki's the author of the wonderful memoir, Daughter of the Queen of Sheba, and has many additional accolades, including being a board member of the Choose International Writing Center at George Mason. Since 2017, she's led writing workshops in the US and in Ireland, and she's at work on her next memoir. So we're going to begin with a reading from Alice, and please help me welcome Alice McDermott and Jacki Lyden.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, all these wonderful, familiar faces. It pays off to live close to Politics and Prose for 30 years. It's wonderful, wonderful to be here. I never really feel a book has really been published until I get to stand in this wonderful bookstore among so many friendly faces. And thank you to Jacki for adding some cool polish to the evening. I'm just going to read a little snippet. I told Jacki just to maybe give you a sense of the sound and a little bit of the fury of this particular novel. Most of the novel is a look back by a woman who was a young woman in Saigon in 1963. A memoir addressed sort of like a letter, but as I said to my editor originally, of course it's not really a letter because nobody would write a letter that long, and if they did, nobody else would ever read it. So it's a faux epistolary novel. Tricia is responding to a question from a now adult woman who was a child in Saigon. In 1963. But she digresses, because she does, and she tells a little story about another sort of historic moment that she lived through. And this was when she, as a new college grad, She's an Irish Catholic girl from Yonkers. She just graduated from Marymount on the Upper East Side. And she has been swept up by a social justice charismatic friend, and they've decided June 1961 to drive together down to Birmingham to help some Catholic nuns that they know who are going to be registering voters. On the way, they stop at Stella's Aunt Lorraine's house in Charlottesville, where she is married to a Bronx-bred professor there. When dinner was served, we moved to the elegant little table. Aunt Lorraine called it a cold summer supper. Slices of roast chicken, a cool tomato aspic, potato salad, pickled snap beans, freshly baked biscuits warm in my hand. There was also white wine in delicate crystal glasses that the professor made sure we never emptied. As everyone talked, delightfully, I felt my own silence, my usual shyness melting away. Felt welcome to this brave new world of large antebellum houses and colored servants, modern art, brilliant minds. No doubt the mint julep and the Riesling had much to do with it, but at some point I heard myself say to the professor, this smart guy, "You know, you are the spitting image of my father's best friend, Mr. Tannen," and then added, showing off, his doppelganger. The professor's glasses might have flashed in the lovely candlelight. "Is that so?" he asked, as if charmed by the notion. I was somewhat astonished and yet thrilled by my own sudden leap into loquaciousness. "You might even be related." Aunt Lorraine smiled too, no doubt aware of the source of my sudden garrulousness, my foolish, "I know another old Jewish guy" repartee. She said, "Tell us about your father. What subject does he teach?" Here I hesitated. I had said earlier, before the alcohol had loosened my tongue, that he worked at a high school in the Bronx, but I had not said he was a janitor. Stella interceded. "He's not a teacher," she told her aunt. "Patsy's father actually works for a living. He's a custodian at the school." "Ah," Aunt Lorraine said pleasantly. "He used to be a stevedore," I added. It was my mother's word. She had preferred it to longshoreman. Same as his brother was, but after his brother was killed in an accident on the docks, très tragique, proving that I was a college girl, my mother asked him to give it up, to work at something less dangerous. "And was your mother Irish too?" Aunt Lorraine asked, letting me know she knew my mother was gone, that Stella had already offered her this much of my biography. I said her parents were. In those days, it was my way of saying, "No, she's an American." Aunt Lorraine asked if I had siblings, and when I said no, she asked, "Are there cousins about? Aunts and uncles?" Stella spoke up again. "Patsy has the luxury of living alone with her father, just the two of them." And then she added dramatically, "You have no idea how much I envy her." "A large family is a blessing," Aunt Lorraine said. "I am not going to have children," Stella declared, "only parakeets." Last I heard from her, she had 5. Children, that is. Once more, the professor filled our glasses. As the dishes were cleared by the maid, Aunt Lorraine steered the conversation to our plans for tomorrow. The professor had mapped out a route for us, and she had arranged for our lunches to be packed, sandwiches and a couple of Cokes, so we wouldn't have to be diverted into small towns along the way. The pillows and sleeping bags she was lending us were already in the hallway. This was the first time I realized that we would be sleeping on the convent floor in Birmingham. Aunt Lorraine had the address and the phone number of the sisters we were staying with. She actually knew one of them, but still she wanted us to assure her, "Please assure me," was exactly how she put it, that we would not go wandering off by ourselves, especially at night. "There's been some violence of late," she said, "as you well know." "Of course we know," Stella told her. And despite what's being said by young Mr. Kennedy, she meant Bobby, I don't believe there's been much cooling off. "It's going to get worse," the professor added, speaking softly as if to himself, and Lorraine replied, continuing some conversation it was clear they had already had, "Yes, it's going to get worse, I'm afraid." There was a pause in which we all seemed to consider this. And then Stella said, "I hope it does. It needs to get worse." The maid returned with small dishes of vanilla ice cream, scattered with strawberries and garnished with more mint. We all thanked her, remarked on how lovely it looked, and then Aunt Lorraine said when she was gone, "I'm not out to dissuade you girls. What you're doing is very brave. I'm just asking you to be careful." Stella raised her chin, pushed her smudged glasses back on her nose, and said, "Why's that?" In her voice, the familiar sound, familiar to me, of a struck match, a match struck, held hissing to a short fuse. "Because I want you to be safe," Aunt Lorraine said simply. "I don't want you hurt." "Nothing will change if we're all keeping safe," Stella told her, "if no one gets hurt." I saw the professor smile at this, glance from Stella to his only mildly bemused wife. Something in his manner said he had identified a promising student. "The issue is complicated," Aunt Lorraine said softly. But Stella was at the height of her Stella-ness. "No, the issue isn't complicated," she said, full of fury. I saw how she was moving her hand over the pale tablecloth, touching the rim of her ice cream dish as if to feel around it. For a moment, I was grateful that the maid had collected our dinner knives. I'm sick to death of hearing how the issue is complicated, bold, brazen. The issue is actually quite simple. There has to be a break with the past. There has to be retribution. The candlelight might have caught or caused the tears that were suddenly standing in her eyes. Nothing breaks without violence, Aunt Lorraine. There's no retribution without blood. Her eyes shifted toward me, shifted back. This is exactly why we're going to Birmingham. There was another pause. Into it, I might have asked, "It is?" But Aunt Lorraine and her husband were studying Stella with appreciation and concern. "You are full of passion, young lady," Aunt Lorraine said finally. And then the professor whispered, "Tikkun olam." He smiled at us all. "An ancient midrash," he explained. "Your Mr. Tannen would know it," he told me. "It means repair the world." He gazed at Stella across the candlelight, a favorite student. "The Jews know that everything God has created is in need of repair, flawed and imperfect." He gestured, kind of like this house. Fix one thing for certain, something somewhere else is already broken. Aunt Lorraine laughed quietly, her eyes cast down. "Easy enough to live with this when you're old like us," he went on, "but when you're young," and he paused to run his hand over his bald pate, his little apostolic flame of white baby hair. "When you're young, it's fuel to the fire of a sympathetic heart." He smiled at Stella again. "Tikkun olam," he said. "Go forth and do likewise." At some point during our time together in Saigon, I gave the phrase to your mother. It might have been the only thing I ever gave her. I watched her turn the words over in her mind. In my memory, I see her turning it over quite literally in her hands. Repair the world. She shook her head, said something both condescending and admiring about the hubris of the Jews. And then she looked at me with her smarter than everyone smile. But don't you know, Tricia, she told me, the Buddhists say, mend yourself.
Thank you, Alice. That was absolutely beautiful. And, you know, as I think we've not given anything away by saying this is a novel set against the early days of the Vietnam War, and I'm thinking only Alice McDermott would feel that that's not enough. We also have to look at American social justice issues at the same time. So we're going to go to Birmingham, but after that, Saigon. Yes. Well, that's probably, you know, I think I've read all of Alice's novels now. I'm an ardent fan as well as a friend. And this one is so powerful and mesmerizing, and it just is a beautiful dagger in velvet language. And I think what it carves up is our hearts and psyches. And I want to think about the women in here, and none of the men here, which includes my own husband tonight, should feel that this is in any sense a novel about women. It's about us, and in many ways I think these women stand in for us. It's about female friendships, but it's also about those of us who are vulnerable, which these women are. Can I just read the very first couple of lines? Because Sue Call here from Politics and Prose and I were just both remarking how exquisite it is, and it speaks to my point. There were so many cocktail parties in those days, and when they were held in the afternoon, we called them garden parties, but they were cocktail parties nonetheless. You have no idea what it was like for us, the women, I mean, the wives. No one who gets married today is going to have that sense of I hope, what a straitjacket that was for these women. So let's kind of get to it. This is 1963. That is the year that the feminine mystique comes out, written by, of course, Betty Friedan. And she famously mentions, for anyone here who may not know, but I think we have a pretty knowledgeable crowd here, that this is the problem that has no name. You know, when she writes about the stifling that women could feel in those days. And when we meet Patricia, she is as happy as can be. You would think he had an assignment to Paris. And the husband is Peter. He's an oil engineer. Pretty quickly on, we realize that most of these guys are Catholics in action, CIA, hired by, you know, Bill Donovan. Peter feels a little less than some of the Ivy League gentlemen that he's with. But is Patricia a foil for us, would you say? She is your major protagonist, and everything is new to her. Patricia is the one who is showing off, saying doppelganger and things like that, and Stella is her friend. Is she us?
Yeah, thank you. I hope so. I mean, I think it's understandable. People have to sell books, and the easy way to get people interested in reading a novel, made up stuff that's not going to change your life. What Auden said about poetry, poetry makes nothing happen, novels make nothing happen. And so categorizing, especially literary fiction, is an easy way to say, this is a book about, this is a feminist book, this is a book about women.
I hope I haven't said that.
No, but I think all of us who write, essentially, we hope we're writing about us. We're trying to get at all of our experiences, the human experience, if you want to give it a grand term. But as storytellers, we have to do that through individual lives. So Tricia is a woman who has been, before the novel begins, it's implied that she has received a message, a letter, maybe a real short one, from this woman who was a little girl in Saigon with her. Brainy, whose mother is Charlene and sort of is the largest force among the women at this time and place. And so she has asked Patricia, do you remember me? Do you remember my mother? And that is Tricia's invitation to recall through time what that was like, what her life was like. And I'm glad that you said that, because I think there's an assumption that because she was a helpmeet, she was a 23-year-old newlywed following her husband, whose career was going. They're both working class Yonkers kids, but he's gone to law school. He's brilliant. And she's gonna be the helpmeet. That in some way we should assume that she was miserable and not and suppressed. She recalls her newlywed days, understanding her own innocence, understanding the innocence of the American community she was in 1963 in Saigon, but not discounting her happiness and the joy she felt as a young newlywed, especially since she found out newlywed sex is really something. And for an Irish Catholic girl, that can keep you happy for a very long time.
Well, we'll talk more about that before we finish this conversation. But, it's an innocence that gives nothing away to say that she's bound to lose. And Friedan talked about, the problem that has no name. And this woman didn't have a problem. She didn't have that problem that has no name when she went over to Vietnam. And I want to say one more thing. To me, this was a female quiet American, the Graham Greene novel. And I went back to it this afternoone, and Greene has written a line for Fowler, the British correspondent, played by Michael King in the movie. And he's addressing Pyle, the American, and he says, I hope to God you know what you're doing here. Oh, I know your motives are good. They always are. I wish sometimes you had a few bad motives. You might understand a little more about human beings. That applies to your country, too, Pyle. And I thought, Alice McDermott has written about some bad people. Which brings us to, Charlene and Patricia. Two women, the two women at the center of this. Rainey is the daughter, but I think that it's fair to say that Patricia and Charlene carry a lot of it, most of it. It is a complicated friendship from the first moment. I mean, think about this. You meet someone whose baby throws up on your beautiful silk sheath. I would have wanted to smack that person. But Patricia is drawn into Charlene's world that way because she's literally undressed and looking at as her dress is being washed and cleaned, and thinking about the Vietnamese, young maid who's helping her, and this lulls the two of them. There's a lot of dressing and undressing here in this whole book, of dolls and other people and our psyches. She's lulled right away into basically the second version of Stella, which is Charlene.
Right. Patricia is, again, only child. Her mother has died when she was 17, lives alone with her father, the stevedore. And Charlene is somewhat older. She's a corporate wife. She has 3 children. She knows her way around the world. She certainly knows how to entertain.
Fluent French.
And she sweeps up Tricia in her efforts to do good, Charlene's efforts to do good. Charlene is all about repairing the world, although she's the one who also pushes back and says, but the Buddhists want you to mend yourself. Which is it? Which in some ways becomes the central question of the novel. While all the husbands are out repairing the world on behalf of the people in South Vietnam, the women in the novel are taking care of themselves and their families and the children and feeling that responsibility. But it was Graham Greene and the Quiet Americans.
Did you think of him right with this?
Oh, my goodness, yeah. Right away, actually. the epigraph. There were 2 epigraphs. This is the first time in my career that my editor allowed me to have an epigraph. I came up with epigraphs for every other novel, and he would look at them and say, "Oh, that's too pretentious for you." Oh, wonderful poetry, Sanskrit, all kinds of stuff. No. Yeah, that's. This time he let me do an epigraph. And the first one is from Siegfried Sassoon's poem, a war poem called Absolution. And the first line is, "The anguish of the earth absolves our eyes," followed by the last line of Graham Greene's The Quiet American, "But how I wished there existed someone to whom I could say that I was sorry." So to be absolved does not necessarily eliminate the hope to be resolved, to be absolved again and again.
Well, I sincerely didn't know that because I had the advanced reader's copy, which doesn't have the epigrams in it. So
Before I was allowed to do it.
Took a wild guess
Yes,
there.
yeah.
Yeah. And well, but you know, what is fascinating is you've pulled back a curtain because we never get to see who the helpmeets were. We never get to see what, you know, often like in Middle East reporting, in my own experience, people will say, isn't it a disadvantage to being a woman? You get a different story, and often a more intimate story, and more of a civilian story, which is exactly what Charlene and Patricia get. But they also sort of Charlene goes to the dark side. She may start off feeling like Tikam Olan, but it will get more complicated than that. I'd want to talk a little bit about this conceit you have, which is so brilliant. It's just brilliant. And, you know, I never, ever ask anybody where they get their ideas, and I'm not going to ask you. But quickly, through this little Rainey, who has a Barbie doll, and Lily, who is the maid who's helping Patricia sort of, clean up and tidy her dress. As it's just sort of a pastime, Lily, the maid, not her real name because she's Vietnamese, Lee, I think is her real name, makes this beautiful little Vietnamese gown called the Ao Yai, which I think we've all seen. It's long and very shapely, and then there's loose pajama pants underneath it. And this is riveting to them. And this doll, I thought, we dress dolls to do things we can't. You've got 2 cultures together in his, Barbie. And then she makes her the straw hat the Vietnamese wear. And the doll almost becomes like an effigy figure at the end to me. So talk about those 3 layers. You've got a little girl with a doll. You've got these 2 women with a doll. They're going to sell these dolls.
Well, so this goes back to kind of the origin, back to my first reading of The Quiet American, which would have been as an undergrad in the early 70s before the fall of Saigon. And 2 reactions that I had first time I read it, and probably every time I've read it since, was, oh my gosh, how did Graham Greene get it so right about how wrong we were going to be in our role in Vietnam? Just even that part that you read, when, yeah, you guys have good intentions, and yeah, you're going to screw it up. And I mean, I remember thinking, when we were still protesting, why didn't JFK read The Quiet American? Did he read The Quiet American? Why didn't LBJ read The Quiet American? I mean, it was all there. Quiet American was published in 55 or 56.
Yep.
He laid it all out. But the women in the novel, this is Graham Greene, are shallow and uninteresting. The main Vietnamese character is doll-like. Although I think Greene is too good a novelist. There are a couple of things she says, there's all kinds of stuff going on there, maybe despite the author. But there was one scene in particular, right before an explosion that sort of turns the whole plot of the novel, and Fowler, the hardened British journalist, looks over and he sees 2 young American girls, college girls, finishing up their ice cream in this milk bar. And he thinks about how clean they look and how uncomplicated they must be, and how you can't even imagine the sweat of sex on them. Just ridiculous. And even as a 19-year-old, I thought, these are two college girls having ice cream in Saigon in the 1950s. These are two really interesting women. What the heck is he talking about? So I always found that fascination with the minor characters that the most brilliant, unfortunately, mostly brilliant male writers just skip right over and never pause to see. 30 years inside the Beltway, how many times, in so many ways, I ran into women who I thought, they could have been models, people who had been in the Foreign Service as young women or had been military wives, and lived all over the world. And if you asked them, began to tell fascinating stories. Then my friend Ellie here, who was in Saigon in 1963, mentioned at some party somewhere where we were together, selling little Audies for Barbie dolls to raise money. The women now, Ellie's version, the real version, was that they took scraps from their own dressmakers, and these women made the Barbie dolls themselves. When she told me this, I remembered being a kid on Long Island, probably about the same time, being sent to play Barbies with a girl I didn't really know. She might have been new, or maybe they were just passing through. My mother arranged it, and she had a Barbie doll that was wearing an aoyai. And so this is what I think all of us who tell stories love, that sort of ripple across time. Here I am as an adult having this conversation with Ellie about and then I have this memory of being a kid in Elmont, and I didn't ask where she got where this came from. I just knew I wanted one because it wasn't in the catalog and it was really pretty. So it's like envy and resentment that I had to play with this girl I didn't really know are sort of the main parts. But I thought that's a way into this story, but I needed an origin story for a Barbie doll in an aoyai. And that's how Charlene burst into the novel. As this woman who's, one of the first things she says in the novel is, I want to do good, but it takes money.
Yeah.
And those are the two conflicting issues in the way she tries to repair the world.
And I'll get it nearly any way I can, which certainly right away, is that conflict about, how to do good. Is she repairing herself or the world?
Right.
That question that you mentioned a moment ago. Charlene also has night terrors. She takes pills. She has men in her aura. We don't know if there's actual affairs, but her pull on Tricia is that they're going to go out into Saigon and parts beyond Saigon. And they're going to go into some of these places the men don't go, like a hospital where children are being treated after attacks. We're not exactly certain, who's behind this napalm attack that some of these children are suffering for. And Patricia longs for her own child, and doesn't have one. And they go into this ward, and I thought, how did she get into that ward? You were so in there with her, looking at these children. And that's where their relationship becomes even more complicated. Because Patricia holds this burned child to her. And and it says their bodies become one, as I call the reading. But it's Charlene who comes in and says, of the little girl, my own, my own. And you're thinking, what does she mean by that?
Yeah.
Because she has her own children. She has her Barbies. How is this little girl her own? But it's a very important line.
Yes, yeah. And this is, again, this effort to do good on Charlene's part, but the awareness that it takes money. She sells first the Barbie doll clothes, and then she gets a bunch of stolen Barbies from Macy's, where her sister works, who seems to be of the same ilk. And then they actually sell the Barbies themselves at exorbitant prices as souvenirs in Saigon.
There's a lot of five-fingered on the five-finger
Yes,
bar.
but I mean this is, when Charlene first burst on the scene, Tricia is like, oh, I know this girl of privilege who gets you to do things for her, who takes over from shy girls and makes them do things.
Like she's a Barbie.
Yeah, exactly. And that's pretty much how I felt when Charlene burst on the scene, sort of pushy, really annoying. A dynamo is what Tricia's husband calls her, not in a nice way, not meaning anything good by it at that time. But then Charlene really becomes, at one point, Tricia says, Charlene says something about suffering, like universal, mostly children. She's really interested in the suffering of children and how do we alleviate this, but any suffering. And Charlene speaks the word suffering with the kind of disdain that Tricia says she would also use in speaking about someone who wore white shoes after Labor Day. It's like Charlene wants everything to be right. She wants everyone, to borrow from Gatsby, at moral attention. And along with that is this sense that she will somehow alleviate suffering, even if it's just with a lollipop or a silk outfit for someone with leprosy, for instance, which becomes one of her goals.
Yes, they will go there in a moment or two. They do go to a leper colony, but before we get there, I want to talk about yet another layer of drama between them, because it's Charlene who shows up after Patricia. This is not giving any way to talk about the miscarriage. No. Patricia has a miscarriage, and she almost can't. She has this amazing line, I thought. She said, I didn't want to be a woman who has just had a miscarriage. I wanted to go out to the party, these endless soirees for the expats and the wives. Not the sort of woman who has a miscarriage, of whom they might say, poor Mrs. Kelly has had an encounter with a bad pregnancy, if you can laugh about these things. And it's Charlene who comes and comforts her and gives her, I have this statue myself. I bought it on 7th Street because it was when NPR had just moved to that part of town, a bodhisattva that is taking care of children, but that it's not it's not left the earthly plane, right?
Right. It
chose to stay with the suffering.
Right,
once.
right. And this Jinzo that Tricia gets a statue of is the Bodhisattva that comforts children who have been miscarried, who have not had enough life to have done good deeds and are stuck forever on a riverbank, piling stones. They can't cross over because they haven't lived. And there are demons in this limbo, as Charlene calls it. And Jinzo protects the children because the demons come and knock over their stones. And Charlene tells this story to Tricia because one of the Vietnamese servants has given, when Tricia miscarries, has given her this little stone statue. And it becomes, in some ways, another indication of Charlene's insistence that we can do good even if it is ultimately inconsequential. These souls do not cross the riverbank. They simply haven't lived long enough. And the futile piling of stones is all they do. And yet there's a protector there for them. And yet there is some sense, and it becomes a kind of refrain, of the need for inconsequential good. Good that's not going to repair the world, but we do it anyway.
Well, it's the kind of protection that, at that moment, at least, Charlene wants to offer Patricia. And she takes on this wife of effectively the CEO of the whole place, the general, was it the new ambassador's wife, Marilee, sorry. And she says to her, talking about suffering, we're capable of turning away, Marilee, turning away from so much, of not looking. And as she's making this speech, she's talking about a leper colony that she wants to take Patricia to. And it's an exquisitely, this is what I meant when I said the dagger wrapped inside the silk. That speech, wow, bravo, you know, because you are coming from a moral place here, and that can be a real stumbling block to good fiction, you know. It's only someone with your no, seriously. And who likes the good girls? And you know, I gotta say, not me. And in your novels, you know, they're often wrestling with ambiguity and desire, but ooh, they're not as, you know, nasty as Charlene can get. And I'm so refreshing to see that you let yourself do that, Alice, at long last. I want to talk about another. So they go to this leper colony, and this really odd thing happens. Really odd. They are making beautiful silk clothing for these maimed people. And this time it's reversed because it's Tricia who writes these cruel little notes to identify who they're sewing and cutting for. Lily, the seamstress, has a relative in there. I think it was a cousin. Mm-hmm. And you just can't believe you're inside this colony, and it's everything Vietnam was. It is the injured and the maimed who feel as if can't be saved, set in this incredible beauty. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just thought that was spectacular, and that's where we meet yet another American,
yes,
the doctor.
Yeah, in some ways, you know, once I realized that a good portion of the novel was going to be in Southeast Asia among these naive Americans, and besides Graham Greene, you know, always at my back, I heard Joseph Conrad breathing down my neck.
Yes.
So there was a sense of, there needs to be a journey into some sort of heart of darkness for these women in their effort to do good. Charlene just sort of makes this up in a catty way that they're going to do this because she doesn't like this major's wife who's trying to tell her that what she's doing is useless. Inconsequential. But when I was doing research for my last novel, The Ninth Hour, and reading about all these different orders of nuns, one that really fascinated me was Sister Marianne Cope, who brought a bunch of women to Hawaii to work with the lepers. Famously, Father Damien was over there, but of course the women don't get any press. But she actually did more. And as I was reading about her and reading about all these different orders, but Sister Marianne Cope, they were an order from Syracuse. Word went out. Does any of you nuns want to move to Hawaii, never come back, and take care of the lepers? And she was the only one who said, yes, me and 5 other sisters will go. And she told her sisters, this is an aside, but I love it, I guarantee if you come with me, I guarantee you will never catch leprosy. You will not get, and they never did. No nuns from that order who went there. But she was Sister Marianne Cope was Mother Marianne Cope was very fashionable. And when she got there, she had the idea that we must make nice clothes for these women. We must teach them arts and crafts so they can decorate their rooms. That just because they're suffering, don't be overwhelmed by their physical needs. They also need beauty in their lives. So I think that somehow fed into Charlene. There was nothing I could do with it in The Ninth Hour. We weren't going to Hawaii in that book. So Charlene gets this idea that, we'll go and we will at least there's nothing we can do for them except to take care of their ills as best we can, and then to give them beautiful clothes, to tell them we are not looking away from you. We're looking straight into that heart of darkness or the heart of suffering. And at one point, there's a young GI who goes along with them, Dominic. And he assures Tricia, when Tricia's sort of feeling this was stupid, and the Viet Cong are just waiting for them to leave. So at nightfall, they will come into the leprosarium and take what other medical supplies are left. And she's thinking, what the hell am I doing, risking my life in this place? And Dominic says, you made the lepers laugh. that they're really Albert Schweitzer should be giving you a medal, because as you were measuring the women for their clothing, they were giggling and they were laughing. That's your inconsequential good. You made the lepers laugh.
It's so powerful, Alice. It's just, we've already mentioned 3. I said to her in the green room that, it's like these scenes are like dioramas into the soul. They're just so incredible. But here's another thing that happens. That's where things begin to literally spin out of control for Charlene and Patricia, and a little bit for the men. Their heart of darkness hour comes. And it comes in the form of a character I've never seen you write about. And she has to encounter something, Patricia, so human. So this figure, he's introduced to us as a doctor. We presume that he is, but he's clearly a spy of some sort. He speaks fluent Vietnamese and French, and he's just coming out of the jungle, and he's a disgusting mess. He smells, and he is he's dirty, and his shirt is open, and he's not young. He's 50 something, but he's brawny and he's muscular, and Patricia finds that when she looks at him. And he's really a jerk too. He's sort of blunt and doesn't arrogant. She is just full of lust, barely controllable lust. It's quite delicious, really.
Those Catholic girls.
Well,
little dirt, little mud.
She can clean him up a wee bit. No, but I thought it's just like it's good because this lust for survival is bursting out of this crazy, having been in conflict zones myself, that lust for survival is like the last thing to go. You really need it. And she's being reawakened to it. And in a sense, she thought her marriage was beyond perfect, but, she's not producing a baby. And that sort of starts to quiet things down emotionally between them. And in steps this figure who to me was almost like, the ultimate American too. I don't know. He jumbles things up.
Yeah, he was a character who appeared, and I thought, okay, if I were a guy writing this would be my main character. This mysterious, shouldn't be sexy, but he thinks he is, and he's, there's something otherworldly about him too, which what he brings Tricia to is a sense of futility. She kind of he mocks what the women are doing in a very subtle way, but enough so that Tricia kind of wants to side with him against Charlene.
You say for a moment, I had the insane thought that I was a rival.
Yes, exactly.
I love that line.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And he sort of sucks out of her any. It's almost freeing. There's nothing you can do. Life is short, and we're just bodies. And what are we doing here? Why am I putting myself at risk for these unfortunates who are just bound for a horrible death? He brings that, and in some ways he brings it to all 3 of the women, because Lily, the Vietnamese seamstress, is also there with them. So it is a kind of, a couple of readers have said to me, I thought for sure a bomb was going to go off, or somebody was going to get...
It just didn't, yeah.
It's like, it's all internal. It's all internal, right?
No, it's so we will, just one last quick question from me before we open it to you for the next 10 minutes, which is, to think of the whole notion of absolution. This, it's the faux epistolary novel. When Rainey and Patricia communicate much later, and they're both living long time in the United States, they're both sorting through their lives. And you said something like, they have to decide now between movement and stability. Americans had at that point become addicted to movement, as if movement itself were about doing good. But of course, sometimes it's just movement.
It's just movement, yeah. And I think, and this, for me, this was why it was important that this novel be related from the present, not an as it happens on the ground in 1963, and that there be voices looking through the decades, that eternal question, we're all asking it now, in the aftermath of war, or even in the middle of it, when we say, what for? What was it for? And so there's a kind of disquiet in the lives of these women as they're older and looking back. Rainey has sort of chooses domesticity, chooses, I'll just take care of my own. I'm not going to be out to repair the world. But there's also a kind of restlessness that whatever we fought for, we're not settled well into it. And her relationship with her mother, Charlene, looking back on it, is very much a part of that.
Yeah, it shifts and shifts and shifts. So to find out more about the sense of absolution, you have to read the entire book. And we very much hope that everybody here will, and everybody listening on YouTube will. And it's just wonderful. Congratulations,
Thank
Alice.
you.
It's
Thank
so
you.
fantastic.
Thank you. Should we do some questions?
We will take a few questions here, please. I think you all know the drill here at Politics and Prose, which is to go to the microphone. And please keep them relatively short, because I'm sure there'll be more than one question. So who would like to be first? First question.
First is always the hardest.
And Ellen, thank you for the doll contribution.
I've given almost all your novels to the Irish contingent in Syracuse, New York.
Thank you.
My brother married my sister's roommate at Marymount at Tarrytown on the Hudson.
Okay.
And your doctor character sounds like Dr. Thomas Dooley arriving late to Asia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah. Very likely. I mean, there were also, as Jacki pointed out, that there were also CIA people nefariously trying to find that third force that Graham Greene talked about. So he may be that. The novel is full of sort of twinning and dualities. For every character, there's a match to Charlene and Patricia and Rainey, and so there is this mysterious doctor in this kind of heart of darkness segment. Later in the novel, it's just a brief mention, but Dominic, the GI, who goes along to the leper colony now as an older man, also coming towards the end of his life, mentions that a child of his who has Down syndrome was operated on by a doctor just coming through who just knew how to repair this kid's heart. So there's the nefarious, maybe not so certain what his motives are, doctor in Vietnam, and then all these years later, there's an angelic visitation of someone who actually does good.
Completely forgotten figure.
No.
The 20 years of that war, the 3 million lives lost, half of them Vietnamese. It's just, you've done so. What a tapestry. Yes, please.
So your research was so spectacular, and I'd like to just talk to you about things that mattered to me in the book, but that might not be fair to the group.
Wonderful.
So I'm wondering, you talked about a fun fact that you discovered during the 9th hour you weren't able to use in your book. What's one for this book?
Oh, my goodness. I don't know how many facts are actually in this. Yes, okay, no. Again, it was sort of something that I thought I had a recollection of. I sort of remembered hearing as a child, but I went in search for. Also in 1963, Jacqueline Kennedy lost a child.
That was my favorite fun fact.
Okay. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, many of you may even remember that. I was just a kid, but I remember there was only a few days that he was alive. He was sent up to Children's Hospital in Boston. JFK was up there with him. Pierre Salant, when the child died after only a few days, and with a lung problem that babies don't die of anymore. Pierre Salinger held a press conference, and he announced that Patrick Bouvier Kennedy had passed away at a certain hour. There was a gasp among the press. And then a question was asked, has Mrs. Kennedy been told? And he said, not yet. Yes. Yeah. And again, I had this vague, because I think my mother was probably watching television and probably going, and that stayed with me. There is a YouTube. It actually, that was something I only vaguely remembered. I thought it can't possibly be true. There is actually a YouTube. That was what it was like in 1963, and it seems astonishing to us now. Some young readers think it's astonishing that women wore stockings in Saigon to parties when it was 100 degrees. But yeah, so I had to put it in. That's a fact, a historical fact that I had to put into the
Just for the record,
novel.
she spoiled the book. I didn't.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more.
I just listened to you on a podcast recently, and you mentioned that you think books should never be about what they're about, which I thought was beautiful. I loved that and agree.
Most people hate that.
I love that.
Like students.
But I would love to know then, maybe in the context of this book, how do you then come up with it? Is it the story first and then the theme presents itself, or do you have a theme in mind and then you develop the plot?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know how many young writers in MFA programs, especially at Hopkins, I've driven crazy with looking at their stories or their novels and saying, it's just too much about what it's about, and I would see the looks on their faces. What the hell does that mean? But after time, every once in a while they'd come back and say, yeah, you were right. It was too much about. So it's that I have something to say, I, the author, and I'm going to make sure this novel says it for me, and I'm going to use the characters as puppets or fronts for my thoughts, my feelings, my beliefs. The opposite of that is to put yourself at the service of the character. The writer puts herself at the service of the characters and says, who are you? Show me who you are. Let me hear who you are. And then in the course of just the work of writing, to make something vivid, to make something clear, to make something logical, to find the right details, to get the rhythm of the sentences and the paragraphs and the chapters. While doing that, working with language, when you're lucky, I think you begin to discover things about your characters that you didn't know you knew. It is a sense of the characters revealing themselves to you. So more and more, when I first started at this, I thought I had to know the beginning and the end. I had to have an outline and every little permutation and I have a whole cast of characters. And this is my 9th novel, so I've been doing this for quite some time. Now I know, just listen. Work at the language and listen. So this novel began with, I need an origin story for that fascinating Barbie doll outfit that evoked that weird memory for me. But in doing that, I need to find out who are these women. And then, so ultimately, I think when I hear people say this is a novel about the Vietnam War, I say, no, it's not. That was 63. It's no war. It's not about what it's about. It's about many of the things we don't have language for. I think that's what
The problem
you
that
hope
has
for.
no name.
Right.
All right. That seems like a really good point to put a pin in it. I hope you'll all come up here and have Alice sign your books. And thank you for being a great artist.
Thank you all.